Have you ever been mocked by the people who were supposed to believe in you first? I was by my own parents. And I stayed silent longer than anyone expected. My name is Olivia Carter. And the first time my parents mocked my business out loud, it wasn't even meant to hurt me. It happened at my mother's birthday dinner, one of those gatherings where everyone dresses a little too nicely and speaks a little too loudly, as if volume alone could turn small talk into proof of success. The table was full: relatives, a few family friends, people who had known me since I was a kid. People who still thought they knew exactly who I was. Someone asked the usual question. "So, Olivia, what are you doing these days?" Before I could answer, my father laughed. Not cruelly. Casually. Like it was harmless. "She runs a little online shop," he said, waving his hand. "You know, one of those internet things." My mother smiled and added, "It keeps her busy. But we keep telling her it's not a real job." A few people chuckled. Someone nodded sympathetically. Another asked when I planned to do something more stable. I felt my face grow warm, but I didn't speak. I focused on my plate, on the clink of cutlery, on the way the room kept moving as if nothing important had just happened. "Don't get me wrong," my dad continued, clearly enjoying the attention. "It's cute. But it's more of a hobby than a career." Cute. That word settled into my chest and stayed there. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I didn't list numbers or hours or sacrifices. I just smiled politely and let them talk. I'd learned a long time ago that explaining myself to people who had already decided my worth was a waste of breath. As the conversation moved on, I sat quietly, listening to my parents laugh with people who believed them. In that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. They had already written my story for me, and in their version, I was the punchline. Being underestimated didn't start with my online shop. It started long before I ever knew what a business was. Growing up, I was never the child my parents worried about or celebrated. I was the quiet one, the one who didn't cause trouble, didn't demand attention, didn't bring home stories dramatic enough to retell at dinner parties. My achievements were met with polite nods, while everyone else's milestones were announced like headlines. If I brought home a good grade, my mother would say, "That's nice," and immediately pivot to talking about someone else's promotion or engagement. If I stayed up late working on something I cared about, my father would ask why I was wasting my time instead of doing something practical. The message was never cruel. It was worse than that, it was dismissive. When I decided not to follow a traditional career path, the disappointment was quiet but constant. "You're smart," my parents would say. "You could do so much better." Better always meant safer, more respectable, something they could explain to other people without lowering their voices. So when I started my online shop, they treated it like a phase. Something I would outgrow once reality caught up with me. They never asked how it worked. Never asked how much time it took. Never asked if it was growing. To them, it was just Olivia's little project. Over time, I learned how to exist in the background of my own family. I learned not to bring up my plans, because they'd be met with doubt. I learned not to celebrate my progress, because it made people uncomfortable. I learned that silence was easier than trying to prove myself to people who had already decided who I was. What hurt most wasn't the lack of praise. It was the assumption that if something didn't look impressive to them, it couldn't possibly matter. By the time I reached adulthood, being underestimated felt familiar. Almost expected. And without realizing it at first, I adapted. I stopped trying to be understood. I stopped asking for permission. I focused on one thing instead, building something quietly, while the world that doubted me looked the other way. What my parents called a little online shop never looked small from the inside. Behind that harmless phrase was a routine that consumed nearly every hour of my day. I woke up before sunrise, not because I had to, but because I couldn't afford not to. Orders didn't pause just because I was tired. Customers didn't care that I was doing everything myself in the beginning, sourcing products, answering emails, managing inventory, fixing problems no one else ever saw. While my parents imagined me casually clicking around on a laptop, I was negotiating with suppliers across time zones, studying shipping delays like chess moves, and learning skills I never planned to master. Marketing, logistics, customer psychology, crisis management. I learned them all the hard way through mistakes that cost me sleep, money, and more than a few moments of doubt. There were nights I sat on the floor of my apartment surrounded by boxes, wondering if I was being irresponsible or brave. Some months, growth came so fast it terrified me. Other months, it slowed just enough to make me question everything. Through it all, I kept going, because stopping felt worse than failing. What my family never saw was how calculated my silence was. I didn't talk about my shop because I didn't want opinions from people who had never asked questions. I didn't explain my progress because I knew it would be reduced to luck, or brushed off as temporary. And I didn't share numbers not because there were none, but because they wouldn't be believed until someone else said them out loud. So I let them think what they wanted. While they joked about stability, I built systems. While they compared me to people with job titles, I hired my first contractor. While they waited for me to quit, I reinvested everything back into the business and watched it compound quietly. There was no dramatic announcement. No moment where I felt suddenly successful. Just a steady accumulation of proof that I was doing something right. The irony was hard to ignore. The less I explained, the more focused I became. The more they underestimated me, the less pressure I felt to perform for anyone but myself. By the time my parents dismissed my work as a hobby, the shop was already bigger than anything they imagined. They just didn't know it yet. There's a difference between being underestimated and being dismissed entirely. For years, I tolerated the first. The second was where everything changed. It happened during a casual phone call with my parents a few weeks after my mother's birthday dinner. Nothing dramatic. No raised voices. Just the usual check-in that never really felt like one. My father asked how things were going. I said, busy. That was all. There was a pause on the line and then he sighed, the kind of sigh that carried judgment without needing words. You know, Olivia, he said, this online thing. It's fine for now. But you can't build a future on something like that. My mother chimed in immediately. We're just worried about you. You're not getting any younger. At some point, you need a real career. A real career. I stared at the wall in my apartment, listening to them speak about my life as if I wasn't the one living it. As if the years I'd poured into my work didn't count because they didn't recognize the shape of it. Then my father said the sentence that crossed the line. If this doesn't work out, he said calmly, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. Not concern. Not advice. A verdict. Something in me went still. I realized, in that moment, that they had already decided the ending of my story. In their minds, failure wasn't a possibility, it was an expectation. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't list sacrifices or progress or plans. Instead, I said, I understand, and ended the call. Afterward, I sat in silence for a long time. Not angry. Not sad. Just clear. I understood that no amount of explaining would change how they saw me. And I finally accepted something I had avoided for years. I didn't need their approval to continue. That was the moment I stopped waiting to be believed and started letting the truth speak on its own time. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried between supplier invoices and customer support alerts. I almost deleted it without opening it. The subject line read, Interview Request Fortune Magazine. I assumed it was spam. Or a mistake. Something meant for someone else. I opened it anyway. The message was polite, professional, and unsettling in the way truth sometimes is when it shows up uninvited. A senior editor explained that Fortune was profiling fast-growing, founder-led companies that had scaled quietly outside traditional systems. My company, my online shop, as my parents liked to call it, had come up repeatedly in their research. They wanted to talk. I reread the email 3 times before it sank in. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because they described something no one in my family had ever said out loud. This was a business. The editor didn't ask if it was a hobby. She asked about revenue growth. About supply chain decisions. About how I handled scaling without outside funding. She referenced metrics, market positioning, and long-term strategy like they were obvious facts, not things I needed to justify. During the call later that week, I sat at my desk surrounded by spreadsheets and shipping schedules, answering questions I'd spent years answering only for myself. I talked about mistakes that nearly sank me, about the nights I slept on the floor next to inventory because deadlines didn't care about comfort, About decisions that looked risky on the outside but were calculated from the inside. No one interrupted. No one laughed. No one asked when I planned to get a real job. They listened. When the interview ended, the editor said something that stayed with me long after the call disconnected. "You've built something rare," she said. "And you did it without asking permission." A few weeks later, Fortune sent over the draft headline for fact-checking. It didn't include the word shop. It called me a founder. It described my company as a rapidly scaling operation with a valuation range my parents would have considered impossible for someone like me. It framed my silence not as uncertainty, but as focus. My unconventional path not as risk, but as strategy. I stared at the screen, not smiling, not crying, just breathing. This wasn't vindication. It was recognition. The kind that arrives without explanation, without negotiation, without needing to convince anyone who had already made up their mind. For the first time, someone else had told my story exactly as it was. And I hadn't needed to say a word to make them see it. The article went live on a Thursday morning. I didn't announce it. I didn't post it on social media. I didn't send the link to anyone in my family. I simply opened my laptop, refreshed the page, and saw my name, Olivia Carter, in a Fortune magazine headline. It felt strangely quiet. Within hours, messages started coming in from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Former classmates. Old coworkers. Distant relatives. They all used the same language: impressive, unexpected, inspiring. Words that had never been associated with me before. I read them, then went back to work. By the afternoon, my phone started ringing. My mother called first. I watched it vibrate on the desk, the same name flashing across the screen that had once introduced me as someone with a little online shop. I let it ring. Then my father called. Then both of them together. By the time I finally checked my messages, there were voicemails stacked one after another, voices strained, confused, suddenly careful. "Why didn't you tell us? We had no idea it was this big. We're just shocked." Shocked wasn't the word that came to my mind. What struck me most was the timing. The recognition hadn't changed who I was or what I'd built. It had only changed how visible it was to them. The work had existed long before Fortune noticed it, and long before my parents believed it. Later that evening, I received a text from my mother with the article link, followed by a single sentence: "We're proud of you." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Pride, I realized, had finally arrived, but it had come from a magazine first, not from home. When I finally agreed to meet my parents, the tone was different from anything I'd heard before. They were careful with their words. Slower. Softer. As if one wrong sentence might undo something fragile. My father started with an apology that sounded rehearsed. He said they had only been worried about me. That they didn't understand the business world I was in. That they never meant to discourage me. My mother followed quickly. "We always knew you were capable," she said. "We just didn't realize how serious it was." Serious. That word landed strangely, considering how many times they had laughed it off before. I listened without interrupting, noticing how both of them avoided mentioning the jokes, the dismissive comments, the certainty that I would fail. Then came the question I'd expected. "Why didn't you tell us?" My father asked. I looked at them for a moment before answering. "You never asked," I said. Silence filled the space between us. I explained calmly that I had stopped sharing because every explanation had been met with doubt. That confidence had always required proof, and proof had only mattered once someone else validated it. They nodded, eyes lowered, but something was missing. There was regret, but not responsibility. An apology for the outcome, not for the years that led to it. I wasn't angry. I wasn't seeking closure. I simply understood that some apologies arrive after the damage is done, not because people are cruel but because they are comfortable misunderstanding you for too long. And comfort, once challenged, doesn't turn into accountability overnight. For a long time, I thought this story was about success, about proving something to the people who doubted me. But standing on the other side of it now, I know that wasn't what really changed. The article didn't make me confident. I had already learned to trust myself in the quiet moments no one saw. It didn't suddenly give my work value. That value existed long before a magazine put it into words. What changed was my relationship with expectation. I stopped measuring myself against the version of me my parents had imagined. I stopped hoping that one day they would wake up and see me clearly. Their recognition, when it finally came, felt distant not because it wasn't real but because I no longer needed it. The biggest shift wasn't external. It was internal. I learned that being underestimated doesn't mean being wrong. That silence can be intentional, not passive. And that sometimes the most powerful response to doubt is simply continuing forward without explaining yourself. My parents still ask questions now. They listen more carefully. But I don't confuse curiosity with permission anymore. Fortune magazine didn't rewrite my story. It only revealed what had been there all along. What truly changed was this. I stopped waiting for validation before believing in my own work. And once I did, everything else, recognition, respect, distance, peace, fell into its proper place. Before you leave, I want to speak to you not as a character in a story, but as a real person who lived this. If my journey resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think I handled my parents the right way? Would you have done something differently? Your comments matter not just to support me, but because so many people reading them are quietly living the same story. When you share your perspective, you give someone else courage. Here's the lesson I want to leave you with. You don't need permission to take your life seriously. Not from family. Not from friends. Not from anyone who benefits from underestimating you. If you're building something quietly, imperfectly, stubbornly, protect it. Let results speak when words no longer work. Silence isn't weakness when it's chosen. Boundaries aren't cruelty when they're necessary. If this story gave you clarity, strength, or even just the feeling that you're not alone, please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing. Stay engaged. Tell your story in the comments. We're building a space where quiet resilience is finally heard.